I remember my first night sleeping homeless, and I like crawl under this evergreen tree and I light a little fire. Boy, oh boy, yeah, that started, about just over a decade of rough sleeping. It was raining and I had walked for so long, and that's homelessness, walking. Yeah. I had walked so long that the socks, they had embedded up into my feet.
Oh my gosh.
And when I pulled my sock off, it was like, brrr,
oh my,
and blood and bleeding and everything. Yeah, sorry, you might want to edit that out.
Homelessness is absence of choice, because nobody sleeps outside if they have that choice.
When I got my first apartment, that wasn't the end of my homelessness. Yeah. That was the end of my houselessness. I was housed, but I was still homeless.
Right.
And I was homeless for years after I had a place.
Yeah.
Because I didn't unpack here and here. We have to start to have that conversation around unlearning, coalesce and collect the wisdom from our knowledge holders in community. Each community is different. My leaders are Indigenous, it's a kinship model of care, and it's different.
This podcast is sponsored by Pulse for Good. Real change starts with listening. Pulse for Good helps organizations get honest feedback from the people they serve. Learn more at pulseforgood.com/invisible. And we are so grateful to Blake and the Pulse for Good team for sponsoring this podcast, because without their support, this podcast would not be able to continue. This episode is a powerful conversation with Shane Pelletier, who is one of my favorite people and the executive director for the National Indigenous Homelessness Council. Shane shares his personal journey through homelessness and recovery, and how that experience led him to become a national leader advocating for community-led solutions to Indigenous homelessness in Canada. We talk about trauma, resilience, and why mainstream approaches often fail Indigenous communities. This one is honest, emotional, and deeply important.
I actually kind of wanted to start off just by saying how I really identify with your audience, as a person with lived experience, rough sleeping on the streets of both Edmonton and Vancouver. If somebody just listens to the first minute of this podcast, I just want to say, I have hope for you. You can do it. We can do it. I've done it. You've done it. We're doing it. Yeah. Don't give up.
Yeah.
And let's go.
That's a great start.
Hope.
Yeah. I did not know you were. I probably knew you were sleeping rough. I haven't been over. I have 29 years sober, and I don't remember where I parked my car.
Yeah. Yeah. So my homelessness journey started when I was around 15. I grew up in a home with domestic violence, and, eventually it chased me out. Like a lot of people, turn to light drugs to medicate, it's in pain, right? Yeah. And so I'm on the streets and, doing the do and hustling. And, I remember my first night sleeping homeless, and I didn't know what I was doing. Like I was I was totally out of my element.
Right.
And I like crawl under this evergreen tree and I light a little fire, and it's just like this storybook, night out when you're a little kid. And boy, oh boy, yeah, that started, about just over a decade of rough sleeping.
Wow. My first night homeless, it's interesting. I ask this question sometimes. I got kicked out of Scientology. There's a whole backstory there. I won't go into it. There was a Scientology rehab. That's all my parents could afford. They didn't know what they're putting me in, whatever. All of a sudden, I'm exited out into Koreatown, Los Angeles. And I only had cowboy boots at the time. I don't even wear cowboy boots at all anymore. But I knew North Hollywood area, which is probably good 10, 11 miles. And I walked because I didn't know where else to go. And my feet were so swollen and I didn't know what to do. And I would go to what I remember as like a safe park. Because I'm thinking, I got to sleep on grass.
Yep.
I would go to this park and there would be gang members or there would be some element that I just didn't feel safe. So right around 3 a.m, exhausted, feet hurting, I find a place to lay down, probably got about 5 minutes of sleep and the sprinklers went off.
You throw your hands up to God. And
Right. I can laugh about it now.
Yeah.
But that was, this is homelessness, right? This is homelessness.
Well, and I totally relate with the feet thing. I know people who have lost legs, lost arms, lost limbs, but I remember this one time it was raining and I had walked for so long. And that's homelessness, walking.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Walking.
A lot.
Homelessness equals walking.
Yeah.
And I had walked so long that the socks had actually you know how socks are, the way they're knit, they're kind of cross knit.
Yeah.
They had embedded up into my bottoms of my feet.
Oh my gosh.
And when I pulled my sock off, it was like, brrrr,
oh my,
and blood and bleeding and everything. Yeah, sorry. You might want to edit that out. But, I get it. I identify,
right. We were just in Minnesota. So indigenous homelessness is a crisis everywhere, but it's much more prevalent here in the States. African Americans are overly represented. People of color are overly represented. Here, it's indigenous homelessness.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between Black homelessness in the States and indigenous homelessness in Canada. And, I'm indigenous. I learned about some of my Métis roots as a teenager. Again, domestic violence, you get separated from culture and community. And then just more recently learned that I have some grandparents that have connection to First Nation up in southern Saskatchewan, or down in southern Saskatchewan rather. So I kind of came to this work through my own personal experience of homelessness and then working in the shelter system and so on and so forth. Eventually I ended up in Saskatoon. Funny enough, another pinch me, but I had a Habitat for Humanity house. That's really what pulled me out of poverty. But we sold everything, moved to Saskatoon, and I'm looking for a job and I can't find a job. And this is just, another one of these things. Can't find a job. And I'm putting out resumes at Home Depot. I need something.
Right,
I'm willing to do anything.
Yeah.
And I get an email from Provincial Métis Housing Corporation. Hey, your phone number on your resume is wrong. We've been trying to get a hold of you. I'm like, you're kidding me. So I go back, reflect on my resume, and sure enough, one number is wrong. I don't know how it happened.
Oh, wow.
But I'm like, are you just what?
Wow.
So any of the jobs I applied for, I'm like, surely they're not going to want me. I made a clerical error like this.
Right.
First of all, so I got into Indigenous work through that organization, and
so it was fate.
It was fate, and not only that, it was kind of kismet too, because I'm in the interview, and of course, in the Indigenous community, it's who are you? What's your last name? What's your family? Who are you?
Right.
The gentleman that's interviewing me, who's your family? I'm like, well, I go into the story, right? Well, I've never met my, and he's like, oh, I grew up with your dad.
Wow.
I'm your cousin. I'm your dad's cousin.
Wow.
And I said, I just instantly boom. It was so interesting, how that happened. And that was the first person on that side of my family that I met, of my Indigenous side of my family.
Wow.
And so I got the job, not because of that, but
Right.
So I started working for them. And, a couple years in, there was a opportunity to sit on an advisory committee. And my boss told me, put your hand up for that, go and sit on that table. And so I did. And that kind of led me into this organization, forming this organization, really. And that was in around 2018. So we're just starting out. National Indigenous Homelessness Council. Our organization is a coalition, and this is how it kind of happens in the Indigenous community. Is we're a coalition of around 36 organizations.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty big.
It's not, not small.
Yeah.
For Canada, it's good. It's good. The community entities through Reaching Home, there's only around under 80 anyway, or just over 80. So 36 is pretty good. So we do everything in community. We're consensus based. My leaders are Indigenous. It's a kinship model of care. And it's different. One of the things that I learned shifting from the faith-based shelter system and housing first models and all the different coordinated access, all the different models, moving to a distinction kind of based way of being and doing, was that you learn that there are different dimensions of Indigenous homelessness, or of homelessness for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And you start to question the definitions the approaches, the
Right.
models, the knowledge,
Right.
the history. So you're kind of actually unlearning.
Right. Didn't Jesse Thistle do
Yeah.
did
Yeah.
a Canadian definition,
Yeah.
and it included spirituality
Yeah.
and some other things?
Yeah, disconnection was a huge
Yeah.
pillar in that, from place and people and
I forgot
community.
all about
Yeah.
that. It's
Yeah.
brilliant.
The 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness is
Yeah.
what it's called. We also really stand on the Aboriginal Standing Committee's definition of Indigenous homelessness. It's a beautiful,
Right.
beautiful definition. But again, you start to kind of unravel and unlearn some of these things that is baked into you in the sector.
Right.
The
Oh, yeah.
industrialization,
Right.
the institutional sector. You start to see, wow, like, okay, this isn't community-based at all. This approach or that silver bullet or this, where did this come from?
Yeah.
Some lobbyist at some table with some parliamentarian.
Right. Well, it's usually funders. Funders are directing
Yeah.
whatever, and it could be, when I say funders, it could be government funders,
Yeah.
it could be philanthropy, whatever, and they say, oh, this is how you should do it, and then everybody wants the money, and that's the direction things going.
Yeah. Well, and I get it. I have one foot in the federal canoe and one foot in the community canoe. So I understand the challenge, and I
I
understand that
loved how you said that.
the federal government has to use a huge fly swatter to try and solve a problem.
Yeah.
Right? They got to have the widest
yeah.
swath of service
Yeah.
they can. So they have to come up with these silver bullet approaches. Unfortunately for our community members and for our people, it just misses the mark.
Yeah.
They're not valid. A lot of the efficacy of the approaches are not valid with the Indigenous community. So that's the challenge. That's the work ahead of us, is we have to start to have that conversation around unlearning.
Yeah.
But then also start to coalesce and collect the wisdom from our knowledge holders in community. I have leaders that have been doing this for 45 years, 30 years.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
they bring a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge. So it's, for me as a younger person coming up in this sector, it's incumbent on me to like go to them and say, please, like pour into me the community knowledge, and what works in this community. And that's another thing, is the idea that each community is different.
If you run a shelter, a clinic, or a community program, you know how hard it is to get real, honest feedback from the people you serve. Paper surveys get tossed, suggestion boxes are ignored, and the voices that matter most often go unheard. Pulse for Good changes that. Their feedback system includes secure kiosks, wall-mounted units, mobile tablets for outreach workers, toll-free phone numbers, QR codes, and online surveys, so you can reach people right where they're at. Whether it's in a shelter, a clinic, or an encampment, or online, Pulse for Good makes it easy to listen safely, anonymously, and in real time. And with AI-powered sentiment analysis, you don't just get data, you get insight. To learn more, go to pulseforgood.com/invisible. That's pulseforgood.com/invisible.
I remember being in Yellowknife, and there was an older Indigenous man, hard as nails, grandfather type. He said that he slept outside during the winter and cried twice because the weather got below 60. And it's at that moment that I realized homelessness is absence of choice, because nobody, unless they're a research scientist with all kinds of protective gears living in the Arctic or whether, sleeps outside if they have that choice, right? Indigenous culture, you're very much more connected to nature. So living outside isn't necessarily homeless. And I met people like that. While I'm on the same topic, also Yellowknife, and I'm going to play the video tomorrow about a homeless man in Yellowknife named Clayton. Is talking about a Bailey house that the Salvation Army made a 40-unit building, and they never talked to the Indigenous community about it. It's sitting empty, 40 units empty, because it didn't have any nature, it didn't have any culture, it didn't have any Indigenous spirit. It didn't have any connection to them and they're not going to use it.
Yeah, the magnetism to the place. I smile and I laugh, not, because it's funny, but because I knew what you were going to, where you're going to end up there. And that's so often the case. People want to see themselves reflected in the services they use. And that goes for us. That goes for our friends that are walking right now. And that goes for the people that are working in that building.
It goes for anybody when you go into a store or you want to be treated with dignity and respect and have your humanity acknowledged.
Exactly. I love what you said about how homelessness is the lack of a choice. It's so much so the fact that, we hear about survival crimes and how many people are incarcerated right now because of homelessness.
Yeah.
And not only that, but then you follow that and how many people are in the morgue because of homelessness, and so it's like this powerful blight that exists. And I know right now we are doing a pilot project up in Whitehorse, Yukon. My colleagues Irene and Jolyn developed a Indigenous process for prioritization and assessment, a process that brings that humanity and dignity back in to those processes. So
the Canadian road trip changed me. A big part of it was connecting to the Indigenous culture. I'm white. And what I decided early on is I can't tell your story. I can't, right? But I can step away and help you tell your story to a lot of people. And as I traveled around Canada, we highlighted and empowered Indigenous homeless people to tell their own story, but also people such as yourself that are working to help people that are going through disconnection. It was extremely powerful to me. Another memory from Yellowknife is because the sun doesn't set, at least when I was there. You look out your hotel room window and you see everybody passed out. And it was really a spooky experience. And then I was talking to somebody and they said they have a community event that's 2 weeks every year. And everybody gets together and they cook and they build and they have crafts and they have purpose and they stay sober. Right?
Yeah.
And then it's over and they just go back to drinking because they don't have any purpose. And there's people that are coming from very rural Canada where some of it was fly-in. Right? If, the only access is through a plane, but they're coming to the big city and they can't survive for whatever reason. And so they start drinking.
Yeah. The idea of Rat Park, are you familiar with this concept? Oh, so Rat Park was a study that they did in South America somewhere, I believe. It was a study where they put a bunch of rats in a cage and gave them all cocaine. And of course, they would go to the cocaine back and, and then they put the same rats into a cage that had running wheels and tunnels and this and purpose. So you know where I'm going, right? They didn't go back to the cocaine.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was actually this validated study. And that's the idea of that is connection. We want to find connection. We want to have purpose. One of the interesting things that I've been looking at lately is the role of hopelessness and pain. This has been rattling around my brain for a while about, we talk about ending homelessness. Our community doesn't talk about ending homelessness. We believe homelessness can be rare, brief, and non-reoccurring.
Right.
But some of our communities don't even have a word for end.
I was just going to say.
Yeah. One of the things that, it's like asking, how do you end pain? How do you end hopelessness, right?
Right.
I can tell you from my personal experience being homeless, when I got my first apartment, that wasn't the end of my homelessness.
Yeah.
That was the end of my houselessness. I was housed, but I was still homeless.
Right.
And I was homeless for years after I had a place.
Yeah.
Because I didn't unpack here and here.
Yeah.
Everything was on loan. It was temporary.
Yeah.
When's the other shoe going to drop? And so until I developed and grew that attachment to that bed, and to those four walls, that became home. A lot of people have that understanding, but and that's not to say we don't, homelessness isn't part of the journey and isn't part of the solution.
Right.
I hold both views,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and
yeah. You were correct when you said there's a lot of similarities between African American homelessness and indigenous homelessness, mostly racism. There's one big difference, and that's the residential schools.
yeah, the residential school system in Canada is part of, Canada's shared history. And, I love what Murray Sinclair said, that after they did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, reconciliation is for all Canadians. Whether you attended or whether you didn't, you were still a part of this history.
Yeah.
And so it becomes all of our responsibility. And the last residential schools closed in 1996. Like, this isn't part of our, way back when.
Right.
This was in the 90s. We were, kids, I'm not
Right.
kids, but,
Right.
teens or young adults. And such a great work. The TRC and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in Canada here.
Yeah.
We see it everywhere on the street.
Right.
Because now what we're seeing is grandkids of residential school survivors who are accessing services if they're not already in the child and family system.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges we have as a country is that these feeder systems into homelessness, like the child welfare, and I'm sure it's similar down in the States, but I can't remember what the stat is, but it's a very high number. If you're an Indigenous youth that is in care, the chances of you ending up homeless, I want to say it's like 60%.
Yeah,
it's high. I think I read a stat that it was somewhere from Stats
foster
Canada.
care
That it
in
was
the
high.
U.S. is high, and I'm sure it's here. And then with the indigenous culture,
I'm not an expert in that. I talk to survivors. I've met survivors. I've had the honor of meeting survivors and hearing their stories firsthand. But what I will say is that we are seeing the generational impacts of this start to happen, and we have over the last couple decades in the homelessness system. So
it was a big learning experience for me. It was a slap into my spirituality because I'd never even heard of residential schools. And then all of a sudden I'm traveling around Canada, concerning topic, and it should be. And I started connecting with survivors or relatives of survivors. The other day we actually were at a shelter here in Ottawa, and we interviewed someone who's 65 years old and was actually a survivor himself. That's a first for me. It was always second or third. And for people that don't know, and we had them in the States, we called them boarding schools. The story that I like to tell about the States, and this was in South Dakota, there was an Indigenous young girl. She spoke her native language and she was punished for it. And then she spoke it again and they cut off one of her fingers and she never spoke again. And that is the treatment. And for those that don't know, governments, Canada, we did it too in the United States, partnered with faith-based organizations. It was kind of, what did they call it in Star Trek had a term, assimilation.
Yes.
Right. But it was really genocide. And in Canada, it's massively has affected the Indigenous culture and is a big reason why people are trying to escape the pain with drugs and alcohol.
Oh, 100%. And I think the term assimilation was actually in some of the documentation pre-Indian Act or even in the Indian Act. So again, I'm not an expert in that, but man, that's such a horrifying story. And again, that's a common thread, the violence, the trauma that can come from that. And it's no wonder. It's and not only that, but it's no wonder that it's intergenerational because it's so deep.
Right.
The wound is so deep. Are you familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate?
Of course.
Yeah, no, right?
Of course.
Epic. A lot about trauma, a lot about pain. And again, he's like, this is a normal response. This is what you would get.
Right.
Given what we had, this is what the outcome is.
I promise this is my last Yellowknife story.
Okay. No, I keep
promise
coming. Yeah.
this is the
Shout out to Yellowknife.
I'm interviewing a woman in a room in the facility. We're just doing an interview, talking like you and I are talking. And she starts sharing about a 21-year-old Indigenous male that brutally raped her until she was completely bloody. And then he waked up from the blackout and tried to kill himself. because then he realized what he did. And she went and saved his life. What a Christian thing, supposedly Christian thing to do, right? And it's always stuck with me. I mean, who would do that to somebody that just brutally raped you? You go and save the person's life. And I asked her why, and she said, because I know he was raped by his father, who was raped in a residential school. And it's just another life that would be wasted. Then she added, oh, it was this room that... And
No.
I always... I forget her name. I
that's
wish I
heavy.
could say it. But just to give her credit, you know, and it changed me.
Yeah.
Because the generational.
Yeah.
And the other is because residential schools taught to be good little kids in the perception of white culture. In the United States, you often have somebody addicted to heroin and their apartment's a mess. Canada, Indigenous, they were taught to make keep everything clean, but they don't have any social skills because they've been ripped apart from their family.
Yeah, I mean, you see the full gamut, the full spectrum of impact, and that story, man, that hits hard, and people are amazing.
Yeah,
humans are amazing. You
Yeah.
know, people are beautiful. The resilience of people and the strength in the core of people. You know, and
so much ugliness, but then
so much humanity.
right
Yeah.
to help another person, understanding that person was raped by their father, who was raped in a residential school.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to. We're at this conference, and there's a big talk at lunch from journalist Connie Walker, award-winning journalist Connie Walker. You know, so much of her work is on helping our sector and understand. You know, because people don't understand the impacts of intergenerational trauma, intergenerational pain, intergenerational violence, and you hear these stories, and then you come to an understanding of, well, no wonder there's people sleeping under a bridge right now.
Yeah.
The pain is so deep. The wounds are so deep. So
Yeah.
that's our job. That's why we're here. That's why I'm here.
Yeah,
you
well,
know?
speaking of-
give a voice to the voiceless and help build understanding. And,
So how do we help prevent and solve Indigenous homelessness in Canada?
we need to go back to community, and we need to follow community's lead. And especially in the Indigenous perspective, when we're talking about homelessness in any community, we're talking about Indigenous homelessness, first of all, because of the disparity and the overrepresentation. When we're in those communities, they're talking about their cousins, their uncles that are the ones that they're trying to serve and help. Community-led approaches, building approaches for our own people, which is just automatically going to have a higher level of value.
Yeah.
Right? You know, you take, for instance, you have a relative, a cousin, or an uncle or something that's on the street, and you're set out to help them. You're gonna bend over. You're gonna do whatever you can. I feel like that is our first step, and I'll just give one step because really, let's just start there.
Yeah.
We need to go back to community and start to unearth those community wisdom, that community knowledge, and follow community's lead in showing us how to work in their community with their people and their family and cousins. And it's been an uphill battle, and trying to turn the federal government around to realize that it's community expertise that's needed. And, we talk about it with, in our community, of people with lived expertise, people's living experience. Those are the people who hold the wisdom around the current solutions. And so that's what we need to do. Yeah. Community-led approaches, community design. I think that's where we start.
Somebody watching or listening wants to support your work. How do they get a hold of you?
So we just started off. We have a website. It's nihc.ca. Follow us on our website. We're on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. I think my team has Instagram. I'm not on Instagram.
Yeah.
But we're
not doing the gram.
We're on socials. Not doing the gram. Not yet. I will. I'll come around.
Yeah.
My wife's been bugging me. I want to share this story with you. Please get on Instagram. No.
Anything you'd like to add?
I would like to talk about the first person I saw homeless. I grew up in a place called St. Albert, Alberta. And St. Albert is called the Bubble, and because it's a bubble. It's a suburb, affluent in ways, and just an insulated suburb. It was the running joke when I was a kid that there was only one homeless person in the town. and it was Louis. I remember driving around when I was around 5 years old in my mom's blue Celica, looking out the window, and there's this guy pushing a shopping cart. And back then we called them bums. There's this guy pushing a shopping cart, and he had 3 or 4 coats on. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew something was wrong. The story goes that, it's the running joke all of my teens. I end up homeless, and fast forward 5 years, and I end up at the doors of a shelter, Herb Jameson Center in Edmonton, Alberta. Who's sitting in the waiting room there with me, waiting for an intake?
Wow.
Louis.
Wow.
And it was just such a earth grounding
Wow.
experience of, wow,
Wow.
I am him. He is
Wow.
me. I always like to tell that story because that's why I do this work.
Yeah.
It's not even work for me.
Yeah.
It's who I am. It's
Yeah.
I see
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see them. You never know. You never know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And you never know who you're interacting with.
That was awesome. Thanks for talking to me.
Yeah.